From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Donald Trump meets with moderate Republicans at the White House with the SALT cap on the agenda. We'll be joined live by one of the lawmakers at that meeting, Congressman Mike Lawler of New York.
Republican Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina also joins this hour on the path forward for disaster aid and other legislative priorities just being lined up. Libby Cantrill of Pimco will also join. Tell us how the market should watch it all.
And as Trump tells Russia's Vladimir Putin to end the war in Ukraine or face a new wave of tariffs and sanctions, we'll bring you an important conversation from Davos with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on this Wednesday for the second day in a row. A meeting at the White House between members of the Republican conference in the House and I guess yesterday the Senate as well. But for 2 days, no firmer answer on what exactly the path forward is.
Which we've been saying for weeks when it comes to reconciliation, the budgeting process, the Trump tax cuts, border security, whether they're in one big, beautiful bill or two. We heard about it earlier from Speaker Mike Johnson.
There's a lot of issues with reconciliation and government funding that we're working through. These are healthy family discussions, not just inside the House Republican Conference, but between the House and Senate Republicans. And that dialogue's going very well. The discussions are going very well. Having gotten this sort of once-in-a-generation opportunity with unified government, there's a lot of anticipation about what will be in that bill, and there's a lot of discussion, healthy debate right now inside, to make it the best possible legislation that we can.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Nancy Cook. So, Nancy, while Republicans try to sort this out among themselves, perhaps one Republican's voice matters the most of all, and that would be that of the president. Does he have a firm opinion on this?
He has indicated that he is sort of open to all the possibilities. So he has vacillated over the past month about doing one bill, two bills. He's made it clear that he wants his agenda done, but a bunch of Trump allies and advisors have said to me that he really, owns the Republican Party at this point. He really needs to set the tone, and therefore he needs to come out and say what he wants, and that's not really what has happened so far.
Well, you've had better luck getting inside Donald Trump's head than most of us to kind of understand what motivates him right now, realizing he just wants to get to the finish line, but he also needs to get the votes. Is he going to yield to Mike Johnson on this in the end? Who will actually make the final call?
I think that, it's a very early, he's only been in office for this is only his third day. Yeah. And so, I don't think that he's going to make the call immediately. I think how Donald Trump works is he really, wants action, and he's going to want to pass tax reform, pass immigration. He wants to pass all these things, but he's usually less sort of controlling and wrapped up in the process and the minutia. Sure. So I think he wants the Hill to kind of work it out amongst themselves. But meanwhile, he has sort of trained Republican politicians and the party itself to look to him for all the answers. So, that's what they're doing, and he's not giving them a clear answer.
So it's like a having cake and eating it too situation, perhaps. And certainly Donald Trump has been busy in the last few days with a series of executive orders have been signed, and of course following through on a number of promises made in his inaugural address, including when he had this to say on Monday about changing DEI policies within the government.
This week, I will also end the government policy of trying to socially engineer race and gender into every aspect of public and private life. We will forge a society that is colorblind and merit-based.
And Nancy, in fact, as of about 4 minutes ago, 5 p.m. on Wednesday, all federal government employees who worked in DEI offices have been placed on paid leave, or at least they were supposed to have been by now. What is the end game here?
I think the end game is that they want to get rid of all of these DEI offices across the federal government. One thing that I have been so struck by, I covered the first Trump White House, I've covered him since 2015, is that this time he is really coming in with a sense of what he wants to do, and not just sort of the big things like the immigration EOs, but even down to, I'm going to get rid of the DEI offices across the federal government. And he's moving very swiftly and sort of has all these plans. And I think that we'll see more of that. They talk so much on the campaign trail of wanting to get rid of these diversity initiatives. I think he thinks that's a campaign promise that he is beholden to supporters to deliver on, and they're just moving quickly. And I have been struck by how they are using all the levers of power that they have in a way that they didn't know how to do in 2016.
They could be laid off in the end, it looks like. We'll keep tabs on this story. Bloomberg's Nancy Cook, thank you so much for getting us started on Balance of Power. President Trump throwing down the gauntlet in front of Russian President Vladimir Putin today, at least on social media, saying in part, settle now and stop this ridiculous war. In all caps, it's only going to get worse. He writes, if we don't make a deal and soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. Ukrainian President Zelenskiy, speaking with Bloomberg earlier today, said that U.S. involvement is crucial.
It can't be without the United States. I will explain you why. Even if some European friends think that it can be, no, it will not be. First of all, nobody will risk without the United States. The second, that's what can divide NATO, divide EU and USA. That is a goal and dream of Putin, to divide this unity.
Joining us now, Bloomberg's Dan Flatley. We have a lot of questions, Dan, from your perch on our national security team here in Washington. Donald Trump saying in that truth post earlier, we can do it the easy way or the hard way. Which will Vladimir Putin choose?
Well, it's interesting. Trump mentioned taxes, tariffs, and sanctions.
Yeah.
So let's unpack that a bit. Taxes and tariffs, I don't think will be operative in this instance. Sanctions are something that is interesting. Obviously, we have thousands of sanctions on Russia at this point, some of them more impactful than others. But right before Biden left office, he signed into existence sanctions on a couple of the Russian oil majors, and that did have an impact. And Scott Bessent, Trump's nominee to be Secretary of the Treasury, has suggested that he would take up those sanctions on more oil majors, which is kind of a tricky thing to do while keeping gas prices low, sanctioning Iran, which is a major oil producer, trying to do some sort of a deal with Saudi Arabia to keep oil on the market. So there's definitely more to be done on Russia sanctions. Whether Trump will need to do it in the end, we'll see. Whether he'll be willing to do it in the end, if there is some sort of deal on the horizon, we don't know yet. So lots to come. But I would not worry too much about the taxes or the tariffs. I would focus more on the sanctions.
Yeah, not a ton that we are importing from Russia at this time, to your point. So it's unclear what Donald Trump is going to be willing to do. Also, if an agreement is reached, if he would be willing to provide U.S. personnel on the ground to act as a peacekeeping force. He hasn't given a signal that he would send U.S. troops to Ukraine. But we are seeing U.S. troops being sent by the Pentagon to the border today. We learned that about 1,500 ground personnel are being sent, in the Pentagon now saying they'll provide airlifts to deport more than 5,000 people. Walk us through the role the military is going to play in this mass deportation effort.
Yeah, pretty interesting. I mean, let's just remember that we've been here before. U.S. active duty troops, which is what we're talking about here, about 1,500 active duty troops being sent to the border to augment about 2,500 National Guard or reserve troops that are already there, in addition to some 20,000 or so Border Patrol agents. So active duty troops have been used in the past, as have reserve troops at the border, mostly in sort of logistical or support roles, not in law enforcement roles, because there is a division between how you can use active duty Department of Defense personnel in that role, in a law enforcement role. Certainly, it does send a signal that Trump is serious about the border, which is what he wants to do. That was, his main point with those executive orders, or several of those executive orders, was getting serious on the border and deploying the military. Potentially, he even did not dismiss the idea of using special forces, in Mexico. That may not happen. It's unlikely at this point to happen, but it could. He certainly didn't dismiss that. So I think it sends certainly a signal, but as to what these troops will actually be doing, we'll have to see some details. But in the past, it's really been more in a support role.
All right, Bloomberg's Dan Flatley, thank you so much, as always. And coming up, we'll take a closer look at President Trump's first week in office and what it means for the markets with Libby Cantrill, Managing Director and Head of U.S. Public Policy at Pimco. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
It is his bully pulpit that enables policy to move on Capitol Hill. It's his prioritization that enables policy to move on Capitol Hill. But the details of that, that's not his business. That's not what he does. It's like he has a contract lawyer. He has a deal lawyer. He has a variety of people that he has doing things like that. But he's going to go focus on the big picture item. And the big picture item here is he wants a reconciliation bill on his desk as quickly as possible with as much policy in it as possible. I'll leave it to you.
That was Patrick McHenry, former Republican congressman from North Carolina and former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, on the early edition of Balance of Power, on the role President Trump is playing in legislative negotiations on Capitol Hill. Joining us now for more on the late edition here on Bloomberg TV and Radio is Libby Cantrill, Managing Director and Head of Public Policy at Pimco. Libby, thanks for joining us as we consider this kind of legislative agenda, if you will, specifically the border, energy, and tax policy measures Donald Trump wants to see pushed through. For your clients that you're talking to, does it matter if this happens sooner or later or all at once or in parts or just if it happens at all?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both, honestly. I think that the assumption in the marketplace is that the extension of the tax cuts will get passed and will get passed before that December 31st, 2025 deadline. However, it matters more to markets if there are some other policies that Trump pursues that gives the markets more indigestion. So, for instance, if he does proceed with some of his tariff threats, we can talk about this. I think it's a little bit premature for the market to declare victory that he's not going to do anything on tariffs. If he moves forward, which he does look like he's doing in earnest in terms of immigration policy, obviously both of those have economic impacts. And so if he's, making the markets eat more of their vegetables than more of their dessert, then I do think that the sequencing does really matter. But if all of this is sort of happening all at once, then maybe a little bit less. I do think there's a big question, though, in terms of what that bill actually includes. Of course, we know that there's going to be an extension of the tax cuts, but for how long? And then importantly, from a deficit perspective and from a yield perspective, what kind of offsets and how significant are those offsets? So again, a lot of open questions here. So to answer your question, though, I think a little bit of both in terms of does this get done and kind of what the timing is.
So let's walk through a couple of these. Libby, everyone's feeling for direction here in Washington and on Wall Street. So let's start with tariffs here, keeping us guessing. In the news conference yesterday, President Trump talked about the potential, at least, for tariffs on China. Once again, here's how he put it.
We're talking about a tariff of 10% on China. Other countries are big abusers also. It's not just China. China's an abuser, but the European Union is very, very bad to us.
Libby, this was supposed to be a day one situation right across the board, he said on the campaign trail. To what extent is the market going to have patience with this uncertainty? For how long?
Yeah, well, I think obviously the market rallied on kind of a relief rally, if you will. I mean, our message to both clients and then also to our traders, though, is that, again, it's maybe premature to be declaring any sort of victory. I go back to what do policymakers believe? And in terms of this particular issue, President Trump has been incredibly consistent, as we've talked about. I mean, you go back to the 1980s, and he was talking about the power of tariffs on Japan. He was opposed to NAFTA in the 1990s. He was opposed to Chinese accession to the WTO in the early aughts. So this has been something that he truly believes in. He does believe that tariffs are often just as much of a solution and maybe not as much of a problem as the market anticipates. And so I do think, again, it's sort of premature to discount this. However, it is revealing that he didn't proceed on day one. And I do think his trade advisor team is very bright. They are very focused on trade law. And I do think that there is going to be some more intentional use of some of these statutes. And I think that, the declaration of an emergency, national emergency under IEEPA, for instance, which would be a pretty unprecedented use of this law, may try to be avoided. So again, I think bottom line here for the markets is tariffs are likely coming. And so people should not, I think, kind of feed into or sort of interpret too much from the fact that he hasn't done anything on it.
Well, obviously, the president views tariffs as not just a way to get more on an even playing field with trading partners, but as a way to raise revenue, fill the Treasury's coffers more so that he can fund those tax cuts we were talking about. But of course, the other side of that ledger is spending, and he would like some pretty serious spending cuts as well. That's what Elon Musk is going to be doing at the Department of Government Efficiency. Considering the way in which federal government spending does factor into things like GDP growth, what are you telling people is a realistic expectation of how much can get cut and how quickly that will happen?
Yeah, and this is something, Kayla, that you all are very focused on, and we try to focus our folks on as well, is just in terms of, a lot of this sounds great on paper. It can be very difficult to find, in particular, 218 votes. And of course, as you know, those are the number of votes that bill needs to pass the House. And of course, because Republicans have a historically narrow majority, actually the most narrow majority of any Republican Congress, really ever in the history of the Republican Party, they're going to be having to navigate a lot of different constituencies, a lot of different stakeholders. And so I think the upshot here is there will likely be some spending cuts. I think some work requirements to Medicaid, for instance, some student loan rolling back, which probably scores positive, some rolling back of the IRA. All of those things, I think, are going to be on the table. However, this idea of like $2 trillion of spending cuts, I think that will be quite difficult. Maybe not impossible, but quite difficult. And then again, the last thing I'll just say on this in terms of a deficit impact, I think a lot of those spending cuts will be spent on additional tax cuts. So it's not to say that that's all going to go down to deficit reduction. I think a lot of that will just sort of justify a bigger, tax bill. So, I think our view is a tax bill will likely add to the deficit, even if there are some spending cuts included.
All right. Well, you mentioned Elon. So let's get to this for a moment. I'm just curious about the impact not only that Elon Musk will have in terms of policy, but how about personality? Vivek Ramaswamy is out. We heard about that, and it had a bit to do with the fact that they didn't really get along. Somebody told you, according to your client note, that he's more of a talker than a doer. But I also saw Sam Altman up there with Donald Trump yesterday. They've had a falling out. To what extent will Elon Musk's relationships drive policy?
Yeah, I think that's obviously an open question. His relationship with the president's a bit different from that of Vivek Ramaswamy, of course. He's a big donor. He also didn't try to run against him in the primary. So probably a bit of a different dynamic. But I do think this is a question about what, I think a lot of folks in the market are just sort of assuming that Doge will be successful. And I think a lot of us, kind of fiscal hawks, will hope that is true. However, it is a question that it is really not a department. Of course, it's not formally part of the government, at least not sort of technically as it relates to Congress. And I think the sort of the statutory kind of remit here is sort of questionable. So I think bottom line is that if Elon is just focused on maximizing efficiency as it relates to technology in the federal government, a big laudable goal, that means one thing from a policy perspective. If it really means spending cuts, I think that's another and probably more difficult to execute.
It's good to see you, Libby.
Good
Thanks for coming back. Libby Cantrill, Managing Director, Head of Public Policy for Pimco, back with us on Bloomberg. And coming up, our exclusive conversation with Argentinian President Javier Milei. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Argentina's President Javier Milei said he would consider leaving the South American trading bloc, Mercosur, if it meant striking a free trade agreement with the United States. Here's part of his exclusive conversation with Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwait.
We are working very hard on the possibility of entering into a free trade agreement. And in fact, when I recently took over as pro tempore president of Mercosur, I pointed out that Mercosur should move forward on three fronts. One related to the fight against terrorism, drug trafficking, and that is also easy to move forward on, bringing down the common external tariff, but also being able to make progress independently. In other words, that each of our countries should have independence to be able to work on trade agreements, because clearly Argentina has decided to become integrated into the rest of the world. It wants to go back to its golden era in history, where it was an important world player. And for that, we need to move forward on free trade agreements. We need to open up the economy, and Mercosur can't become an obstacle to that. Therefore, while we work with the US government to move towards a free trade agreement, we also work indoors within Mercosur so that it won't be an obstacle to move towards free trade. So we're working very hard on that.
Would you leave Mercosur to do a free trade agreement with America?
Well, if the extreme condition were that, yes. However, there are mechanisms that can be used even being within Mercosur. So we think that it can be done without necessarily having to leave Mercosur as such. And it's also worth noting this, because often when comments on the negative consequences of leaving Mercosur, reference is made to the automotive industry. But the automotive industry has an agreement outside the framework of Mercosur, so that is a false argument. So we are exploring ways for Argentina to be able to open up to international trade. And why? Because the division of labor brings prosperity. Adam Smith said so. And 250 years later, Dad holds true. Adam Smith is still right.
You can find Bloomberg's full conversation, a fascinating talk with Argentinian President Javier Milei online or, of course, on the terminal. Big day for Micklethwait. Our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwait, sitting down not only with Milei, but also President Volodymyr Zelenskiy on a truly international day here on Bloomberg.
Yeah, well, this gathering at Davos obviously brings together the top economic, business, and global leadership minds in the world. And guess who's going to be addressing Davos tomorrow?
That's
doing
true.
so virtually, though.
Virtually,
Donald
yes.
Trump.
That would be the President of the United
Eastern.
States. We'll see if he's on time. We'll experience that together tomorrow as well. And coming up, our conversation with Republican Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina. He'll be here live from Capitol Hill on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Our country can no longer deliver basic services in times of emergency, as recently shown by the wonderful people of North Carolina, been treated so badly. And other states who are still suffering from a hurricane that took place many months ago. Or more recently, Los Angeles, where we're watching fires still tragically burn.
President Trump criticizing the previous administration's disaster response efforts. On Friday, he will make the first trip of his second term to hard-hit areas around Los Angeles and Asheville, North Carolina. Joining us now live in studio is Republican Congressman Greg Murphy from North Carolina. Congressman, it's great to have you with us here in person today. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Set the record straight for us on a couple of things. Number one, the extent to which North Carolina has been abandoned, as Donald Trump said. What do you still need? And what do you make of using disaster relief as leverage to get other items passed in the House of Representatives?
North Carolina, I traveled the Monday after the Friday of the hurricane, and this was Hiroshima bomb type of devastation. It was really, really terrible. FEMA in certain places moved on, made regulations. It's just so much of a bureaucratic hurdle to go through. And so, we had some people kicked out of FEMA places and hotels a few weeks ago. FEMA now has promised they wouldn't do that until May 25th. But this is a huge hurdle. Yeah, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, as I try to speak. But we can still take care of the people that are having tragedies in California. But North Carolina, it's going to take years, if not a decade or more, to really get us back to that. As far as tying disaster aid to some really responsible things that go on in the coast there in California, I think it's okay because it needs to ameliorate the factors that have made these fires so devastating. President Trump in his previous term sent something to, Gavin Newsom at the time. Look, let's do better management of land. Let's do better management of water. And Newsom said no. He didn't do that. So I think sometimes the adults have to come into the room and say, this is what's best for your people, best for your country, even if you don't do that for you. So I don't have a problem with that.
Of course, we've heard from sources in Los Angeles this notion that it really is an infrastructure issue. It's not so much about water not being there, but you need to have the capacity to be able to fight fires like this. And no municipal infrastructure is built with that kind of capability, unfortunately, when we're looking at disasters like this. On the point, though, of it being kind of leveraged, and tying it to changes in California, what about tying it to raising the debt ceiling? Do you view that as just as appropriate?
Well, I think we all know we're going to have to raise the debt ceiling. It's going to have to be in some part, some package of one or another, whether it comes through reconciliation or sooner. It's going to have to be done. And so whatever mechanism that we're going to need to use to do that, then that's what we're going to have to do. It's not an if, it's just a when.
You've got a lot of work to do here. I know that it's already been a busy start for you in this new Congress. There are a lot of questions about the agenda. We saw your Speaker, Mike Johnson, at the White House yesterday, along with the Majority Leader in the Senate, John Thune. Every day we're waiting for a directive here from someone, a consensus on how to move forward. How come we don't have one yet?
Well, I think what we've been waiting for are the top-line budget numbers. And Jody Arrington is our chair of budget. That's going to come out with the top-line numbers. Then we're going to work from that. We've been working, Chairman Smith's been working last 18 months, if not longer. We've been traveling around the country listening to people about their concerns about small businesses and their tax concerns. The Trump tax cuts come due at the end of the year. So does some of the expiration with the ACA subsidies. So we have to work very, very hard to thread a needle that isn't millimeters, it's microns thin as far as making sure we get 218. Hopefully some of the Democrats will come along with us.
Well, as you kind of put the puzzle pieces together to get to 218, I do wonder how you see this working with people like Mike Lawler, for example, who has been pleading the SALT case very hard and was meeting with the president at the White House today, versus others who say, why should we give a tax benefit to the richest people in the country when that increasingly is not the base of the Republican Party anymore? How do you square that?
Well, I don't think we should do tax policy according to political boundaries. I think that's absolutely wrong. What we should do is try to have tax policy that is two tenets. Number one is a pro-growth policy that keeps people's money in their hands, in their corporations to grow and employ people. And two, I think just as importantly, pay attention to our debt. I think our debt is our greatest existential threat to this country. We are now, $930 billion paying our interest on our debt. And so we have to do something, again, threading this needle that is tiny aperture to be able to do to make sure that we get 218, we are fiscally responsible, but we are also pro-growth.
I think Kayleigh already invoked the debt ceiling in that chair earlier today. Was your former colleague, Patrick McHenry, a former Republican congressman, actually held the gavel and was chair of the Financial Services Committee. He talked about the negotiations over this constantly controversial matter. Here's what he said.
With Trump, what the Democratic members of the House and Senate want to do for their votes is to raise spending, to increase spending. That is not as popular as cutting spending in America today, and that is not commensurate with the president's commitment to the American people. So the longer this draws out, the more likely the Democratic members get their leverage point to raise spending.
Is your fellow North Carolinian correct?
Yeah, he's a smart member. We really miss Patrick. But I think he's spot on in some of these things. There is an urgency, there is an expediency that we do need to have these things done by. But that said, we are the majority. We are the majority in the House and we are the majority in the Senate. And trying to get all our members on the same page to actually implement something, get it put into law really is pressing upon us. So there are no days off. We have to work on this every day and get this done as soon as possible.
Well, so when we consider all of the numbers at play here, including the tax policy that you and your colleagues on the Ways and Means Committee are going to get to work on, do you have to know first what actually the tariff policy is going to be as you're figuring out the ledger? Because he keeps saying, oh, they could come, the threat is out there, but nothing's being enacted. And how do you look at the picture holistically without clarity on that?
Sure. Well, I mean, you have to remember, today's Tuesday, and so President Trump's not been in office too long. But that said,
fair enough.
I think he's put February 1st as his day that the tariffs will come out. Personally, I don't think we need to, or we should. It's my personal opinion. We should rely on tariffs as a revenue source. It'd be nice if they are. Tariffs are for one reason, in my opinion, and that's to establish free trade or fair trade policy, rather. What comes on a secondary thing as far as any type of revenue is great. It's gravy. But what we need to do is look back and say what things have and what tax policies have been something that is pro-growth, something that's really going to employ people, put money in their pockets, put money in the coffers of the Treasury. But at the same time, again, we have to make sure these are sound policies that do not put us further in debt.
You're a surgeon. You know how to play triage.
I sure do.
When you sit down on the Ways and Means Committee and you look at this massive list beyond just 2017. Add SALT back in, no tax on tips, overtime, Social Security, mortgage interest. I could keep going on forever here. How do you play triage knowing that probably not all of these are going to pass?
Well, not all of them are going to pass because part of them can't be put in reconciliation per the rules, Byrd rule in the Senate. So the Social Security issue is out. Looking at no tax on tips, looking at some of the other things, I personally like to look at the numbers. What is the gain on this? It's nice to have no tax on this, no tax on that. But we do have an obligation to fund our agencies to deal with the debt. So really, I mean, triage is a good point. We had today a long meeting today on Ways and Means where other members came up and gave their desires, what they want to see in tax package. Love to say yes to all of them, but that's not what's happening. We have to hunker down and we have to do the streamline and the basic things that need to be done to run our government, make sure our programs are funded, but also pay attention to what's happening with our debt.
I'd like to ask you about specific government programs that as of today are on the path to going away, ending DEI initiatives across the federal government. As of 5 p.m., the people who worked in those areas are being placed on paid leave. And often we think about DEI in terms of gender or race, but it also, inclusion efforts could affect things like veterans, for example, which I know you work on in the House. And I wonder if you have any concerns about the way in which this is being done, what it might signal for other groups beyond what you might think.
You know, I look at DEI. When I was on the college board, it was all about diversity, but everything except opinion. I think DEI is one of the most denigrating, divisive, demoralizing type of policies that we have because they're saying your worth is not in your mind. It's not in how hard you work. It's what you look like, what you believe. It's something that is so un-American that we've seen in the last 4 years overtake our society. I am happy to see that go away. One of my pet peeves is seeing how DEI has been gone into medical schools and medical institutions when literally lives are on the line. So this is a great day as far as America. Let us come back to meritocracy. This is where Americans of all genders, of all races, of everybody is lifted up. But let us know that that's what's important. Excellence is what is important. And, the consequences are what they are. These programs should have never been there. And the government is not there just as an employment agency.
All right. Republican Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate it as always. And still ahead, an exclusive interview with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskiy and Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, sat down today with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy at Davos, where they discussed the state of the war and the importance of continued U.S. support. Micklethwaite started by asking about getting more troops sent to aid Ukraine.
It's great if we will have troops, but we have to understand that the troops will not be in the center of the capital. Yes. They will not have relaxed time. Yes, it's very important because I heard that some allies said that, yes, but it's okay, we can be in the center of some city, and then no, we don't need such contingents. No. Yes, with our people, of course. Yes, because this means security, and that's it. So, but it can't be. It can't be without the United States. I will explain you why. Even if some European friends think that it can be, no, it will not be. First of all, nobody will risk without the United States. The second, that's what can divide NATO, divide EU and USA. That is a goal and dream of Putin, to divide this unity.
You mentioned China. How important is China in these negotiations? I mean, China is the backer of Russia. They seem to have had an impact on things like Putin not using nuclear weapons, those sort of things. Can China push Putin, and do you have any contact with the Chinese?
I had some contacts with Xi Jinping. We had a phone call during the war. Not too much, not enough, I think. Yes, he can push Putin to peace, I'm sure. I think that only President Trump is the strongest, and Xi Jinping. I think that there is no other allies who can really do it. Yes, because his economy, Putin's economy, after sanctions, after everything, depends very much of China.
You would like Donald Trump and Xi Jinping of China to work together to push Putin?
Yes, but not without us. It's important.
You can find the full conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy, a fascinating talk, online or on the terminal. And Kaylee, a lot of news today coming out of this interview when it comes to the idea of U.S. peacekeeping forces. We don't even have a peace settlement or a ceasefire at this point. And what Donald Trump said about pressing Vladimir Putin to come to a deal or face further sanctions.
Yeah, and not just sanctions. He also threatened tariffs and taxes.
Yeah.
But of course, the U.S. right now is not importing excessive amounts from Russia, given the sanctions that existed. And the Biden administration, on its very end of its way out, enforced further sanctions on things like Russian oil. So it's a question of how many levers are really left to pull, and whether that leverage is enough to force Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table if he's not yet ready to take himself there.
It's also a bit of a sunlight on what Donald Trump has been referring to. He said he had a plan to end the war in Ukraine on day one. Whether this was it, I guess we'll have to see, but we're certainly beyond day one at this point. Coming up, talking salt at the White House. A group of moderate GOP lawmakers earlier today sitting down with President Trump to talk state and local taxes. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. At the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, Bloomberg's David Weston spoke with Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury Secretary and Wall Street Week contributor. He started by asking Summers about the Trump administration's enthusiasm for AI.
Look, Sam and others in the AI world have made a really important point, which is that the ability to do this depends both on great research ideas and very substantial capital in the form of compute and in the form of energy generation to enable that compute. And if the United States wants to lead, it's going to have to build, baby, build, and do it fast. And that's what we're trying to form. We at OpenAI are trying to form coalitions to do. I think the announcement that Sam was part of making, pointing to up to $500 billion in data infrastructure over the next half dozen years, was a very important announcement. I have my differences, some very profound differences with President Trump, but one always has to look at any president in terms of what their strengths are likely to be. And I think his directness, his force of personality
may help him address the sclerosis with which we've sometimes dealt with getting things done quickly in the United States, particularly in the public sector. And so I found the symbolism of, on his second day in office, working on these very ambitious data center plans to be an encouraging bit of symbolism. And I think his impatience with business as usual may serve us well with respect to some regulatory barriers to new building and new construction.
You can find the full conversation with Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, of course, Wall Street Week contributor. His conversation with David Weston online and on the terminal. Joining us now, Bloomberg's Mark Niquette, who is with us in studio. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you here as we look at the agenda. I guess it's not too often that we find Larry Summers agreeing with Donald Trump on something, but that says a lot about this issue.
Right, for sure.
Well, and so it's also very timely that they had this conversation because Donald Trump at the White House yesterday was very proud to stand there and announce next to Masayoshi Son and Sam Altman and Larry Ellison this investment of up to $500 billion in AI infrastructure. I do wonder, though, how much that is actually going to be able to be realistic when you have Elon Musk casting doubt on whether that money is really there at all today.
Yes, and it really sort of exposes a rift in the White House, too. If you have Elon Musk sort of countering, what Donald Trump is trying to present to the public on his second day in office. And you're right, it really does raise questions about whether the money is there for this big investment that Donald Trump is trumpeting as, a huge move forward for his administration in only a second day in office.
Well, you hear Larry Summers say, build, baby, build. And I guess that's the drive here, which comes with massive requirements for energy. We talk about it every day on Bloomberg. There has to be an answer to this by the White House as well, right? If you want to start pumping up AI, you have to start pumping up clean, renewable energy. Will they have enough?
Energy and data centers, too, to process.
To power those data centers. So where do they find it?
Well, that's the question, and that's part of why I think there's a lot of attention on this particular investment announcement because it does speak to the infrastructure that the U.S. is going to need to power AI, right. And if it doesn't come through, that raises obviously questions about the sustainability of the push by the Trump administration in particular to control the development of AI.
So do we see other EOs? For instance, on nuclear, I know that he's not a big fan of wind, but they need more sources of power to either put data centers at the source of the power or start clearing the way, presumably the big red tape in the sky when it comes to nuke plants. But this is a NIMBY issue, isn't it? Where's he going to put them?
Right. And I think where they're going to start, at least from gleaning through the initial EOs that he issued, is permitting reform. I think if they can streamline the permitting for these data centers and for some energy projects to support the infrastructure, I think that's where they'll at least start to have a way to address this problem and get some of this infrastructure online in time for it to be useful.
Well, and that's one of the things Donald Trump says he's offering to people investing in America. Yeah. Easier permit process if you come bearing $1 billion. But it's not just that. He's talking about lower corporate tax rates as well, other kind of tax incentives, which gets us to how quickly those tax incentives can actually be put into place. As we've been discussing this whole hour, we're not really sure in what form a tax package ultimately will work its way through Congress. One bill, two bills. What's going to happen to solve? How much longer do we really have to get that clarity?
Yeah, this is a big question because they have to do tax reform, the extension of the 2017 tax cuts and reconciliation. And, the question is that, like you said, one bill, two bill, and, the individual components of the tax fight, including SALT, just have huge ramifications because, you have to pay for these tax cuts.
Yeah.
Trump is counting on tariff revenue, for example, as a way to help offset the tax cuts. And if you're going to do things like raise the cap or even eliminate the SALT cap, that's just money you have to come up with from some other source to make the numbers balance and get a bill passed.
Mark, you've been to more Trump rallies than most people I'm ever going to talk to. And you just spent a whole season doing this all over again on the campaign trail. You heard the promises made. You also saw the different sides of Trump, like we did this week at the inauguration, We saw scripted Trump in the inaugural address. We saw rally Trump in Emancipation Hall. Which one are we going to get for the next 4 years?
Oh, I think if it's up to Trump, President Trump, you'll get the rally Trump.
Got it.
Because he kind of alluded to this in the speech after the inaugural address, that this was the kind of the speech he really wanted to give. You know, the speech, the inaugural address he gave in the rotunda was kind of, almost low energy Trump, where, it was like, okay, this is what I have to say. But even alluded to
the speech he wanted to give.
In the speech downstairs that, hey, this is what I really wanted to say.
Exactly. All right, Bloomberg's Mark Niquette. Thanks, Mark. Thank you so much. And of course, for more coverage, you can check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power. We'll meet you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.